Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative Webcomics, reviews of Broodhollow, Wilde Life, and False Positive. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics. I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean, and we're two guys with advanced degrees talking about webcomics.
That's right. And on this month's show, we're going to be looking at three interesting webcomics, and it's all in the season of Halloween. We're going to begin with Kris Straub's Broodhollow. After that, we're going to look at Pascalle Lepas Wilde Life. And then we're going to wrap up with Mike Walton's False Positive. But before we get into a discussion of those, we want to let you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Webcomics is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that their discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some wonderful specials. And October is no different. Now, sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off cover price, but often you're going to find discounts that are more impressive than that.
And if you head over to mydigitalcomics.com, that's their sister site where they sell their digital comics. They have quite the selection, and if you purchase anything through them, you'll get 5% towards your DCBS purchases later on. Most of the books they have are in PDF and CBZ formats, and this is pretty cool too. DRM free. I'm a big proponent of that. So. Go check out mydigitalcomics.com as well.
That's right. So whether it's My Digital Comics or Discount Comic Book Service, you can't go wrong. So check them out at dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, digital and otherwise, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the guys with advanced degrees sent you. Sean, how have things been going for you this month?
Oh, it has been, keeping with the horror, the Halloween theme, I'm just going to say a lot of my time seems to have just absolutely vanished this month. It just kind of, poof, disappeared. And, we're recording this a little later than we normally would, I think partially because of that. It's just been crazy busy trying to get stuff done, and one of those where you just blink and 2 or 3 weeks have gone by.
I agree, and you're right. We are recording this a little later in the month than we normally do, and like you, I've just let time get away from me.
It's here. That's the danger of this. I think always goes back to trying to keep a nice balance of everything going. Right, you got your day job, you've got your home life, you've got comics. Where does that all fall into play? I'd love to say comics always take a priority, but I got to pay the mortgage sometimes too. So
yeah. Well, I know you've been busy because you were out of town the tail end of September, and you couldn't join us on our International Podcast Day recording. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that.
I did miss that. I was out on the West Coast, as a matter of fact, visiting with some friends and whatnot. But I did get in some nice comic book stuff while I was out there, too. I happened to be in town for one of the last days of Charles Hatfield's comic book Apocalypse Jack Kirby collection showing. He had out at CSUN out in where is that? LA, I guess it was. Absolutely fantastic collection of original Kirby artwork lining the walls all over the place. A fantastic collection, really well curated pieces. I'm a big fan of Jack Kirby in the first place, and seeing all of those pieces all up close in person, absolutely brilliant. And it's just mind-boggling the sheer volume of work that he put out with such a high degree of creativity and talent on like every piece. Absolutely phenomenal.
Mm. Well, I heard that he had that going on out there, so I'm glad you got to see part of it.
Yeah, and I have to rub that in. I have to make a point of saying that too, because one of our other podcast hosts, Gene, is very upset that he wasn't able to go. So I like to rub that in at least once in a while.
And that's why we have you here on the show, to make Gene feel bad.
Exactly, and I'm happy to fill that role.
Yes. Before we get into our discussion of the webcomics, I want to mention something real quick that one of our dedicated listeners, Rainer Koschnick, mentioned to us the other day. He drew our attention to the fact that Comixology is having a really incredible sale on Vertigo ebooks. Now, I know these aren't webcomics, they're digital, so they're not webcomics, but since we are discussing comics in some kind of digital format, I guess it's somewhat similar. The thing is, by the time this episode goes up on October 19th, it'll be the last day of this sale. So if you're listening to this and you're a big fan of Vertigo, head on over to Comixology, because they have 70% off their digital collection for Vertigo. And I'm looking at that page now. You can find a lot of collections of Preacher, Hellblazer, 100 Bullets, Transmetropolitan, Why the Last Man, American Vampire, Scalped, DMZ, Ex Machina, Sweet Tooth, FBP, Hendrick. It just goes on and on. So this is an incredible sale, 70% off. And if you're listening to this, don't stop listening to this episode. Maybe pause it, or as you're listening to it, you can get to a web browser or your mobile device and take part in this 70% off sale of Vertigo titles.
Some fantastic material there, just in the handful of pieces that you rattled off. I've read a lot of them, and they're absolutely brilliant works.
Yes.
Well worth it.
Yeah, so thank you, Rainer, for remembering us and letting us know about the sale. So, Sean, you want to get into a discussion of the comics for this month?
Absolutely. That's what we're here for, right?
That's right. And it being the month of Halloween, Sean and I thought that we would discuss I don't know if I'd call all of these horror titles, but let's say Halloween-like or horror-ish webcomics. What I mean by that is not all of these are like gothic, horrific, macabre. At least one of the titles that we're looking at is. The others, they're more lighthearted in a way, even humorous at times.
But we do all have the themes of ghosts and goblins and werewolves and spooks that go bump in the night and all sorts of fun stuff like that. So
that's right. So we're going to start off with the strip Broodhollow. This is by Kris Straub, and it has been going on since when? Is it 2012, I think?
Yeah, I did look. It was late 2012, I believe.
Right, and Straub is in his third book within the comic now. I don't know if he's calling them chapters, but God, they're really, really long chapters. But it's interesting because on the website, when you go to the navigation bar, it's called chapters, but then when you go into the chapter section, he calls them books. And I think that as long as each of these quote-unquote chapters are, you may as well just call them books.
Yeah, they are. It's kind of deceptively long. You think 2012, that's only a couple years ago. How much could he have put out? Well, this is Kris Straub. He's been doing webcomics for, seems like forever. He's one of the, you almost might want to call him old guard webcomic artists at this point, because he worked on, before this, you might know the name from Starslip, which ran for several years, starting, I think, over a decade ago now. So he's, at this point, well-versed in how to run a webcomic, how to put together a webcomic and do it on a regular basis. So when he launched Broodhollow, he launched and kept going. So he's been keeping up regular updates since 2012, several times a week, and there's a good amount of material there.
That's right. Now, have you've read Starslip, right?
I haven't read it in its entirety. I've read chunks of it. I was one of those where it didn't come to my attention for whatever reason until it was well underway, and I never had the time to go back and start it from the beginning.
But you're saying it's one of those that made a really big splash in the webcomics community?
It was one of the first, I believe. I couldn't pinpoint exactly the first or where it came in the order, but it was one of the earlier strips that gained a really notable following, and I believe Straub was one of the first web cartoonists to essentially earn a living doing his webcomic. Mm-hmm. Because we're talking, like I said, it was over a decade ago that he started that, and I don't know when exactly he started really making money at it, but he was one of the earlier guys when everybody was still trying to figure out what the heck do we do here? You can give the comic away, or do you pay for it, and do we have some kind of collective where there's advertising that's split among everybody, and there's all these experiments going on. He was at the forefront of that, and was one of the first guys, I think, like I said, to be able to say, yeah, okay, I'm a professional webcomic artist. I'm making enough money off what I do on this webcomic to earn a living. And I don't know, like I said, I don't know if he was the first necessarily, but he's up there as one of the guys who, he knows his stuff. He's done this for a long time and has been and knows what he's doing. He's one of the, I think. Actually, I'm doing a quick check on my bookshelf here. He's one of, I think, 8 people who have worked on or written a book about webcomics.
Huh. Interesting.
Yeah, there's very few. There's only 5 books out there. It's maybe 6. I don't have. My math skills are kind of weak at the moment, but yeah, he worked on a book called How to Make Webcomics with Brad Geiger, Dave Kellett, and Scott Kurtz, who are also 3 of kind of the pillars, I guess you might call them, of the old guard of web cartoonists, guys who have been doing this for 15, in some cases, almost 20 years now. These guys know their stuff. These are guys who, regardless of whether you actually like the material they're producing professional material that a lot of people are responding to.
Right. Now, we should mention that he is also the creator of the gag strip, Chainsaw Suit. And I mention that because if you want to check out Broodhollow, Chainsaw Suit is actually in the URL. So you would go to broodhollow.chainsawsuit.com. And Broodhollow is BROODHOLLOW. So that's the URL for that comic. Now getting into this title, how would you describe this, Sean, to the uninitiated?
It's a really interesting story, I think. It basically follows a character called Wadsworth Zane, and
love that name.
Yeah, he's got a lot of great names throughout all of his characters here. Wadsworth Zane is an encyclopedia salesman. And during I think it was like the 1920s or thereabouts.
This is still Prohibition.
Yeah, there's still Prohibition going on.
Yeah, and he sells the Encyclopedia Atlantica.
And it turns out, or we find out early on in the strip that I think it's his uncle dies and essentially leaves him an inheritance. But he has to go travel out to this small town in the middle of nowhere to collect whatever the inheritance is.
Right. And the town is Broodhollow.
And so he travels out there to collect whatever inheritance is. It turns out that it's an antique shop, and as he's trying to sort through some of the paperwork and the legal aspects of, reclaiming all this, because he's apparently on hard times, it's an encyclopedia salesman for crying out loud. He's trying to take whatever he can out of this because his life has kind of been miserable up to this point. But in the process of going through all this, he's finding this. He's meeting the people of the town of Broodhollow. He's finding some weird kind of quirky things that are going on, both with the characters themselves, but almost more the town itself. And there's something about the town that strikes him as very strange and very odd. And no one else seems to notice this. And he starts pointing out, hey, what about this? What's going on here? What's that thing? And a lot of the townspeople are just like, what? That's just a thing. Why is that weird?
Yeah. If they have any memory of it at all, because one of the things that defines Broodhollow and the other town's members don't necessarily know this is a kind of amnesia. They lose their memory. They don't recall things. In fact, there are occasions where Wadsworth mentions something or an event or someone, and there's a blank stare and a pause for a beat, and then the townsperson goes on as if nothing was even mentioned, and that leads Wadsworth to think, this is weird. Something strange is going on. So we mentioned that we're 3 chapters or 3 books, whatever you want to call them, in, and there is, I think, each of these stories or chapters are to some degree kind of self-contained. They're a cohesive arc, but there's an overall sense of story among all the events that are going on so far among these 3 chapters or books. And I think a big part of what draws all of these narrative arcs together is what you had mentioned, the mystery underlying Broodhollow. There's something about it.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, each one of these books, they do have kind of a self-contained story, and they're all kind of related, right? They've all got the same characters. They're all dealing with the people in the same town, and there's this overarching issue of memory and recollection and tradition, and how all those kind of interplay with one another. But then each book takes kind of a I don't want to say a different spin on that, but delves into it in a slightly different way. And one of the interesting ways to look at that too is he's even got another character in the story who is a psychoanalyst. So he's coming to this story. The Wadsworth character is very I'll say emotional, perhaps.
Yeah, he's a little on the neurotic side.
On the neurotic side, yeah. But then there's this psychoanalyst character who acts as kind of a grounding and a rationale for things. And there's an interesting play throughout the entire thing because you've got Wadsworth looking at these memories and recollections and dreams in a very visceral sense. But then you have the psychoanalyst character kind of coming to the same dreams, the same memory issues, but from a more scientific point of view, or what's at least an attempt at a more scientific issue.
Exactly. In fact, the psychiatrist himself is rather comedic at times. And in his name, you were mentioning the way that Straub deals with names. I love his as well. It's Dr. Klaus Angstrom. And I wanted to ask you about Angstrom and not only his place in Broodhollow, but also the tone that you had mentioned, where there's a psychological nature to this. Now, am not familiar with the other webcomics or the writing of Kris Straub. You are much more than I am. Is there something about Straub's background that does have this scientific or psychological bent to it? Because I found Broodhollow a rather intriguing and intelligent webcomic in terms of some of the things that come up. I mean, Klaus Angstrom is kind of a humorous character, but at the same time, you can tell, or at least I get a sense, that Straub knows what he's talking about when it comes to some psychoanalytic or psychological issues. It seems a smart comic, in other words, and I'm wondering if that comes out in some of Straub's other work. I don't recall, like I said, I haven't read Star Slip in its entirety, but from what I have read, I don't recall any like psychologist or psychoanalyst type characters per se. But what Straub is really good at is just character development in the first place. And I think he's got a very good sense of, I don't know if he has any background in psychology or psychiatry or anything along those lines, but he does have a very good sense of character, both in terms of defining who a person is, but also, making sure that that even the most minute characters have motivations and drives and a reason for whatever it is that they're doing. Even if we're talking about little background characters who are just in one scene for a specific purpose, in many cases, if not all cases, Straub has created, at least for himself, it seems like, a backstory for this character and for who this person is and why they do the things that they do. Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I mention this is that Straub works the psychological angle really well into the narrative itself. So, for instance, Broodhollow begins with Wadsworth, what seems to be Wadsworth laying down on the psychiatrist's couch, kind of classic Freudian, right? And he's telling Dr. Angstrom about some of the issues he has. And so it seems at first that book one begins in kind of a flashback pattern, in that the story that Wadsworth is telling his psychoanalyst is the story that's beginning to unfold. But then we learn fairly early on, and it's just not a spoiler because we learn it not that long into the first book, that Angstrom himself becomes a character in Wadsworth's story, and that Wadsworth is not so much talking to Angstrom as a psychiatrist as he is his friend, but he just happens to be lying down on the couch, and it looks like a psychoanalytic session. So, I mean, there's part of the humor there that I mentioned, but at the same time, I think that the Straub does work the psychological angle into the storytelling itself. So, for instance, the predominance of memory or the lack of memory plays really well into how the story is constructed, and also what creates these gaps of information that create suspense. So I just think that it's really clever the way that Straub is taking a psychological approach to not only his characters, but also in the way that the story unfolds, and how that functions as a way of keeping the reader really engaged. Because when you're talking about things like amnesia, or the town itself having these gaps in its either collective memory or its history, that is very much like the kind of memory issues or anxiety issues that Wadsworth has, that the very act of writing down his dreams, which is what Dr. Angstrom suggests in Book 2 that Wadsworth does, that the story itself is almost like a writing down of these psychological issues that come out. Because some of these stories, especially the one in Chapter 2, seems very dreamlike. So it's like we're reading about the dreams that Wadsworth is having, and he's writing about his dreams as well.
Yeah, and that I think actually that continues to play out through the subsequent chapters. That first book, the first chapter, a lot of that is your basic setup, right? Here's the basic plot, here's the characters, here's the setting. And we start to get into some of the memory issues there, but only at a kind of a real high, kind of scratch the surface level.
Right, and that's a ghost story too.
Right.
That
right.
first book, yeah.
And then as we get into the second and third books, we get a lot more into that. Like you said, we actually start seeing more of Wadsworth's dreams, where they're actually played out for us. They become more significant in their meaning, or at least in the interpretation of their meaning. We get the notations that Wadsworth is, he's sitting down, he's taking notes on here's the dream I had. So even if we're not seeing the dreams, he's starting to catalog them to try and figure out his own neuroses, or what he thinks are his own neuroses. So he's starting to, go through and analyze the dreams that were presented with, but additional ones that aren't actually showing up in the comic. So he'll have discussions with Angstrom about, I was thinking about this, and that could mean this other thing, and because I've been stressed about this issue, that's manifesting itself in my dreams in that issue, or in that manner. And some of them are, I think there's at some point Angstrom says he's not a Freudian type of dream expert. If I remember correctly. So he doesn't apply, the typical kind of dream interpretation model that everybody learns in Psych 101 class. But there's a lot of discussion between Wadsworth and Angstrom on the meanings, possible meanings behind these various dreams. And as the story continues to play out, we actually get to see how some of those dreams are really supposed to be interpreted, right? How much of this is a real issue versus how much of this is a symbolic issue, I guess. Mm-hmm. And we don't see very much of that, but we're starting to, as we get more into it, further along in the story, we start to see how all these pieces build on each other, and you start to get callbacks to earlier memories, earlier dreams, and you can start making connections as a reader in the same way that Wadsworth and Angstrom are making connections in the story as characters.
Right. Now we were talking about Wadsworth and his dreams and memories, keeping the dream diary. I want to talk a little bit about Wadsworth in that I think he's a fascinating character. I mean, I think most of the characters in this webcomic Broodhollow, I think, are interesting, even the minor ones. But the thing about Wadsworth is, if you look at the cast page on the website where you have a rundown of the major and even minor characters in this webcomic. And by the way, I do appreciate a webcomic that provides a page with a cast of characters. Not all webcomics do that, and even sometimes when they do, it's incomplete, I found. But I think that Straub does a pretty good job of providing us with the main players. But I mention this because Wadsworth is described as an anxiety sufferer, phobic, superstitious to a fault. Yet at the same time, he sells encyclopedias, and as he reminds us and others in Broodhollow several times throughout this webcomic, he is a man of reason because, after all, he is an encyclopedia salesman. So I think that that's an interesting tension in Wadsworth's character, in that on the one hand, he does come across as kind of a rational scientific thinker, and I was reminded of this when you were talking about him cataloging his dreams in Book 2. And so, in other words, he is attempting to give order, form, and system to something that is apparent, at least on the surface, a little irrational and ill-formed, his dreams. At the same time, this very rational, categorically minded character is very phobic and superstitious. So I think that that's an interesting combination there, and it's what largely drives his character.
Well, and the interesting thing, too, as a reader of the character, right? And we see Wadsworth at the start is, like you said, we start off, he's on the psychological couch, the psychologist's couch. We know very early on that he's got these, almost OCD type of issues that he's dealing with, and the various phobias and whatnot. And a lot of those are written to comedic effect. right? He's got to make sure all the doors are closed, and he's got to check the mailbox 3 times, and all these kind of little quirks, which are played mostly fairly lightheartedly. But the interesting thing, or one of the interesting things that I got out of the story, is that as we're going forward through the story, he starts talking about the rationale behind that, and that his thinking is that, if he does one of these items, that sets a pattern that prevents something else from happening.
That's right. He's always talking about the pattern. Right.
And then as we get farther and farther into the story, we start getting the sense as a reader that maybe he's not so crazy. Maybe he's actually onto something here. And some of these patterns that that are initially played as, psychosis of some kind, actually bear out to be maybe not definitively, working against a ghost or an alien or what have you, but there's a connection there, and that's an interesting little callback, or not callback, I guess is the wrong word, but it's a parallel to the other part of the story that Straub uses throughout the town as a whole, is this notion of tradition, right? Because what is a tradition but really just an extended pattern, right?
Right, exactly.
And so, like in the town itself, there's one of the kind of running gags is that there's a holiday almost every day.
For the weirdest things.
For the weirdest things, right? And they have all these strange names. I can't recall all of them, but there's a spring cleaning day, and there's a some kind of festival where everybody comes out and holds tuning forks up in the air and hits them all at the same time, and that's a festival or something. And a lot of little strange little holidays that just kind of run throughout the town, and everybody accepts them, and that's cool, and that's just what you're doing. But it's an interesting parallel, I think, that this ongoing talk of tradition within the town compared to Wadsworth and his pattern or attempts at pattern recognition to prevent other dangerous elements from emerging.
As we're talking about Broodhollow, and I don't know if this is any kind of useful comparison at all, but I can't help but think of what used to be one of my favorite shows on television when it was on the air, and that was Monk.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have someone who is very much like Wadsworth Zane, right? He is phobic. His anxieties define him, but yet he is someone who is rational and uses that meticulous sense of trying to make sense of things along with his anxieties. In fact, it's the anxieties actually that fuels his, the wherewithal behind the solving of mysteries, because Wadsworth himself is like a detective figure. He is first an encyclopedic salesman, but he also is a shop owner. That antique shop that he inherited. But I think he does function very much like a detective type figure in these stories.
Mm-hmm. Well, he almost has to, because that's essentially what we're looking at here. Is this whole story is this large kind of detective novel on where the heck is everybody's memory going, right? And it's it's not a traditional detective novel in the sense that there's not, we're not hunting for the killer or the blackmailer or whatever kind of crime du jour is going on. So that the detectiveness is more in the supernatural realm and starts to get into, if it was just, and I think Angstrom points this out at some point too, is it would make sense if one person was having these memory issues. That's not uncommon. But an entire town, that just doesn't happen, right?
Right. It's Monk meets X-Files by way of Twin Peaks.
Yeah, okay. I wouldn't know, I don't know that I'd have gone there personally, but yeah, I could see that.
But yeah, but you're right. I mean, this this does have that detective narrative feel to it to a large degree, which comes back to where we started with Broodhollow in describing this as kind of a horror webcomic. And I don't know if it's more horror or more kind of noir. It's kind of, I mean, it definitely does have the horror elements to it. And, along with that, the mystery that we've been discussing, like almost like a detective or a murder mystery. But it is a different beast in many ways.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I think really works and showcases Straub's ability as a writer. Is he does a very good job, I think, of kind of floating between these different genres. Right? It starts off there's a good chunk where at the very start of that, where it doesn't have, it just seems like almost a gag strip, right? It's got these nice little character beats and punchlines, and it almost kind of feels like, this is just going to be an ongoing drama with a continuity, but basically a gag strip. But then as you start getting into it, he starts kind of shifting things a little bit, and there's a little bit more drama here, and then he plays up the horror aspect a little bit more here, and then he plays up the character development over here. And so any given day, the strip might be a little more skewed one way or another, but there are definitely some elements, when it just gets, okay, this is very much a horror story at this point. There's some, and you and I were talking a little about this earlier, and there was just some frankly disturbing imagery for me, stuff that I just was creeped out by.
Because you're not a horror type of guy.
I'm not a big horror fan in the first place, and so I was a little leery reading, to start this. But then, like I said, the initial however many weeks or whatever that went on, was almost a gag strip. But then it starts getting into this stuff was downright creepy, and and to Straub's credit, it not only is he able to shift the tone pretty deftly from one to the other without, it doesn't feel like there's this sudden crack and, oh wait, this isn't a gag strip anymore. It flows very smoothly, but he also does that with the art as well. The sequences. Most of his art is fairly cartoony, fairly light. Looks like it would be on a Saturday morning cartoon or something.
Right.
But then when he starts getting into the really deep horror elements, it shifts. He still draws the characters the same way, but there's a difference in how he's drawing the backgrounds. There's a difference in how he's coloring everything. He's giving different lighting to it, and it gets really creepy in some places. There's some scenes that are, they're not, I wouldn't say they're nightmare inducing, right? I've read creepier stuff. I've read stuff that scared me more. But this is stuff that's like, okay, he's not just doing, these cartoon figures, right? It's not, from what I read of Starslip, before, it was all, I was expecting these light characters and cartoons throughout the whole thing. And while he does have that same kind of cartoony style, he expresses some good artistic chops as well, shifting the tone of the entire story with both the narrative and the art throughout the whole thing. Right.
Well, I think it's, the way I see it, it's because of the, as you put it, the kind of cartoony style that makes some of the parts of this webcomic so disturbing. Mm-hmm. Now, you've mentioned the cartoonish or the iconic art, and you're right. This is something like you would see on maybe a Nickelodeon show, that kind of art. It looks on the surface kid-friendly. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean that in a negative way. And there are parts of the story elements themselves that I think are rather lighthearted and fun for kids. For instance, we haven't mentioned this yet, but Wadsworth in the first chapter finds a friend, a bat named Mercy. And at first he is scared by bats because of something that happens in town at one point relatively early in the webcomic. But Wadsworth takes as a pet this bat that he gives the name of Mercy. And so Mercy then becomes like his pet that follows him around. And there's something very cute about that. Now, I mention that because along with the art, there is kind of a cuteness factor in Broodhollow. But I think it's the tension and the contrast between the cuteness of this story, both visually and also in terms of its story content, and those disturbing moments that crop up every now and again, like you have referred to. So, for instance, those scenes, let's say in the first book, where the ghosts seem to make their appearance, and when Straub changes the color scheme to where it's something quite darker in terms of tone. I mean, the characters may still look a little cartoonish, but it just has a much more foreboding look to the colors. And then in chapter or book 2, where we have the absence of faces or gaps in holes in characters that are very much like, memory gaps in holes. And those are kind of disturbing because you're right, they are nightmare-like and also potentially nightmare-inducing. But I think it's the way that those scenes are paired along with the iconic or cartoonish look, and sometimes even the content, the cuteness of this story, that makes it kind of even stranger than it would be if this were drawn in a more realistic manner. Yeah,
no, that's an excellent point. That is an excellent point. And I think readers actually, if you want to get a quick read on that, he's got little side story going on right now. It's just like, I think probably only going to be 5 or 6 installments maybe, where basically Wadsworth goes down to the local train station. He's waiting for the train. The train's late. He can't see it. It's at night, so there's no one there. And he looks one way up the tracks. There's nothing. Then he looks the other way down the tracks, and he finally sees some lights off in the distance. He's relieved. Okay, great. The train's finally coming. It's running late, but then as the lights get closer, you see that it's not a train, but some bug-eyed alien. And that there's this, kind of dark and creepy and disturbing kind of imagery. And you can look at that and say, okay, well, this is the type of comic that is. But then if you do a quick shift back to the first installment, you can see, wait, that's maybe not how the whole strip is written, right? It's a very quick way, I think, to kind of get a sense of what we're talking about here, right? You can see this creepiness going on with this train imagery, or this alien that's posing as a train or mistaken as a train, whatever, and compare that to the lightheartedness of Wadsworth and the psychoanalyst couch, which is just his friend's couch, and he's not really in the psych office anyway.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we leave Broodhollow, we have to mention something about a character who is a part of Broodhollow, but also a character that provides almost relief every now and again when Straub is taking a break from the strip for a day or two, and that is the character Cadavre. Or Cadaver. So Cadavre is this French skeleton. So basically a skeleton in a beret, smokes a little cigarette, and has, the stereotypical horizontally striped shirt that we always see French people wearing, right? And he has a place in Broodhollow, especially in Wadsworth's dreams, or his visions, if you want to call them those. Every now and again, Cadavre will appear and converse with Wadsworth. But every now and again, you'll find completely separate strips, like when Straub is wanting to take a break from Broodhollow for a few days. Maybe he's out of town. And so we have almost like these older newspaper type strips that are very gag oriented, where Cadavre is in a situation, and of course there's a punchline at the end.
Yeah, and I think it's an interesting dichotomy he plays with that character too, is because he's got these older style strips that it looks and reads very much like a comic strip that you would read in a 1920s newspaper.
Right.
and he even goes so far as to provide the kind of the yellowed paper effect and whatnot to the background. But then within the context of the story itself, he gets the character gets increasingly, I guess, dramatic might be the best word. He still has the affectation of this Warner Brothers cartoon image of a French deaf person, including the Pepe Le Pew bad accent, right?
Right.
But at the same time, he starts getting more brooding and more ominous as a character. And what he's still talking in this bad French accent, but what he's saying is maybe not quite so friendly and not quite so lighthearted as some of these earlier installments.
Yeah, he's becoming much more existential, another French stereotype.
Right. I think I'm trying to remember exactly where there was a sequence somewhere in book 3, which we're still in the middle of, where there's actually come out of a more of an extended conversation between Wadsworth and Cadaver in his dream about what are you doing? What is this? What's going on? So it's enough to suggest that we don't get any resolution with that at this point. We're still, like I said, in the middle of book 3, but it definitely points to a bigger role for that character, a more significant role.
Right. Before we go to the next comic, we should say a few things about some of the website's layout, the things that are outside of the story itself, because we've primarily been focusing on both the artist and especially the story, of course, of Broodhollow. But, looking at the page, Straub is one of those that does allow for reader response. And he has quite an engaged audience. And if you look underneath almost every single installment that he puts up, and you keep scrolling and you scroll, I mean, there are all of these comments. And not only do you have readers who are responding to what Straub is doing, but they're also holding conversations amongst themselves. So they're talking. It's a very active and dedicated community of readers, it seems.
Yeah, well, I think that goes back to Straub being around for a long time, right? There's, like I said, he's been doing this for a while. The man has a following. There are people who are going to read his comic regardless of what he does. He could finish Broodhollow whenever he finishes it and start on something completely different, and he's going to have an immediate audience for whatever that next project is. There are people who are going to follow him.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to the other thing I wanted to mention about the layout of this site, and that is its navigability. Because, every month when we look at these webcomics, navigability and the site layout, those are things that we tend to look at. And especially for us as reader critics, when we need to flip back and forth between not only chapters but also pages of a webcomic. For Straub to be an old hand at creating webcomics, I'm wondering what his rationale is in let's say, a lack of an archive here, because you do have a menu item where you can, it's this chapter, where you can go from one chapter to another. And as we've mentioned, there are only 3 right now. We're in the middle of the 3rd. But within any one of these chapters or books, if we want to call them that, there's no way of going from one page to the next. So, for instance, if I wanted to point out to you, Sean, in our discussion, something that I remember from the last part of Book 1 or Chapter 1, the only way for me to get there is to go to Chapter 1, click, and then go to the first page and then click through. And, it's quite a substantive chapter. And getting to the end is going to be a series of clicks, 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 clicks. Why isn't there an archive? Why isn't there an easier way to navigate between all of the various pages?
Well, here's the thing. I didn't see that at first, but he does actually have one. But there are a couple of issues with it. One is it's not called an archive. Which is
what is this? What am I missing now?
Okay, if you go along the right-hand side, there's a bit that says Holidays Past with a little bit of calendar underneath it. That is actually his archive. And any of the dates that show up in red are one of his updates. And you can click on that and go to that day's comic.
Oh, yeah, I see that, but that's a calendar. That's not an archive. And, I mean, really, a date on a calendar tells you nothing much of really anything outside of the date that it was published about what page in what chapter that you're trying to get to.
Well, yeah. Now, here's the other difficulty too. Is that if you want to go, right, it's called up in October, right? Default as to the current date.
Right.
If you want to go back to September, you click on the little thing that says "Go back to September,"
right.
and then it loads basically an archive of the entire month of September for you with a little. It's got a little preview, so you can actually kind of scroll through a little quickly, but it still only shows 4 of the dates.
And I see that, and maybe I'm being a little difficult here, and I'm just wanting a little too much here. But there are ways to make this much easier for the reader to get to where they may be wanting to go.
Oh yeah.
And, who knows? There may be a reason why Straub is not being as, shall we say, forthcoming with his navigability among all the various pages in Broodhollow. But if there's a reason, I can't determine it. I just think it would be easier for instance, you and I right now, or the two of us discussing this on the web show or the webcomics episode, if we could easily click back and forth from one chapter, one page to the next, instead of having to scroll calendar-like through the various sections.
Yeah, it really is not a good. I mean, he does have the. I pointed out because there is technically an archive there, but it's like you said, it's not a very good navigation experience. And the only thinking I can put to that, why he might do that, is if he feels that the storyline is important enough that you should read from one of those chapter breaks. And it doesn't make sense to jump in, there's no reason why you should jump into, the middle of chapter 1, the middle of chapter 2, or whatever. You should either start at the beginning of a chapter or start at the very beginning period. That's the only rationale I can think for that, which I don't know that I necessarily agree with. Like you said, it makes things certainly challenging for us as people reviewing. And I have to imagine that there are other people with similar thinking or similar rationales for going through it. Here's another one, actually, I'll point to, is while I'm reading this personally, even setting aside a reviewer point of view, I'm trying to catch up on, 3 or 4 years of the webcomic. So I'm not going to read that all in one sitting. So what I'll do is I'll start at the beginning, I start reading, I get up to some point, and stop and go have lunch or do whatever I'm going to do and come back. The problem I have is that I don't do that I don't come back to the same machine every time, right? The way I work is I have, 3 or 4 machines that I use regularly, including my phone, including my wife's iPad, including my desktop, including, if I'm visiting someone, I'll use their machine sometimes while they're, busy doing something else. And because of that, if I know I need to jump to, the August 2014 episode, but I can't get to it very quickly. And that's very annoying. He does have, interestingly, a save place function.
I see that, yeah.
But
you have to be at the same computer.
But you have to be at the same computer and using the same browser. So it's fine if you only have one location you're working from. But like I said, for my situation, when I'm hopping between different machines, and a lot of my material is honestly, I just house it in the cloud anymore and reference it from wherever. So for me, trying to read through this on multiple machines was a bit of a challenge because of that. Trying to get to whatever point I left off in.
Right. And I know we're being a little critical here, and we don't want to end on a downer note on this webcomic, because I think both you and I really do enjoy Broodhollow. I think it's a well-written story, great art, and it is quite engaging. And he is very good. Straub is great at stringing out the mystery to keep you coming back for more.
Yeah, he does. Honestly, in terms of storytelling, this is absolutely top-notch. Like I said, I think he's done a phenomenal job, both with the characters and the plot and the execution of all that, as well as the artwork. We talked about particularly how the kind of cartoony style compares and works well, contrasting against this kind of darker horror material. Right. And I think on the whole, the story works very, very well. It's just you pretty much need to sit down at one computer and read it through at one sitting almost.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to the second webcomic that we're looking at for this month, and this is Wilde Life. This is written by Pascalle Lepas. And, one of the things that's really good about this webcomic is if you go to the About page, and I'm going to read what's there, it is a very nice and quick encapsulation of what this is all about. Because sometimes in About pages, it tells you about or around what the webcomic is, but I think this one gets to the heart of things. It says, Oscar rented an old house off Craigslist, then things got weird. First it was meeting the ghost of a 1940s mathematician in the upstairs hallway, then it was finding a teenage werewolf in the bathtub. Now Oscar doesn't know what will show up next. Maybe that's okay, as long as nothing eats him. Wilde Life is a supernatural adventure horror series set in a small town in rural Oklahoma. It focuses on stories about creatures from Native American mythology as witnessed and documented by a journalist from Chicago, Illinois. And that's basically what Wilde Life is.
It's, and it's interesting. It's certainly not one of the reasons why we chose both this and Broodhollow, but if you think about it, there's really kind of a similar approach or a similar idea behind both of them, right? You've got your everyman character comes to a different town where all these weird things are going on, and how do they deal with that? The difference being here, as opposed to a kind of a more of a psychological issue, or set of psychological issues, the Oscar character in Wilde Life is dealing with actual supernatural phenomenon, right? He's talking with ghosts, he's talking with werewolves. There's actual, there's a lot more physicality involved with the danger, I guess.
Right. Now, you mentioned similarities between this and Broodhollow, and I wanted to ask you here, maybe I'm not looking in the right places, but on both Wilde Life and Broodhollow, there is toward the bottom of each installment a strip that is a link to a variety of other webcomics, and in fact, if you look, it says "Jump to another comic," and both Wilde Life and Broodhollow are a part of this collective, and I don't think we chose either of these for that reason. It's just fate. It's just the way it turned out.
Right.
But are these part of a larger grouping or cooperative of webcomic creators? Because I can't tell from this little bar at the bottom that asks you to jump to another comic.
As far as I know, I don't believe there's a formal grouping there. I think it's more of a bunch of creators who kind of came up around the same time, and they kind of the interesting thing. One of the interesting things about webcomics generally is the sense of community that builds up, not only among the people we talked about. How Straub has these people that follow him around, and there's these conversations going on underneath his strips, but the webcomic developers themselves also have this community, and all these people, your Kris Straubs, your Dave Kellett's, your Brad Geigars, your Scott Kurtz's, they all kind of came up at the same time and have a kind of a community among themselves. And I think that's what we're seeing here is kind of this grouping of people, of webcomic creators who all, kind of were trying to figure out this webcomic thing at the same time. These are all guys who have been around for several years now. I don't see any of the comics in that strip offhand that are by complete newbies. These are people who all have been working in the 5 to 10 year range, and this might not be their original comic that we're showcasing in the strip and that little that strip at the bottom, but they've been doing strips, they've been doing comics for several years, and I think that's what we're seeing there is kind of a loose collective of, hey, we're all friends, let's promote each other's comic.
Okay. Well, getting back to Wildlife itself, in this strip by far is not near as long as Broodhollow. It actually started last year, I think it was, September of last year. So it's been going on just a little more. In fact, September 29th of 2014. So it's just a little more than a year old. You mentioned that this is much more of an overt supernatural story, and we do have, the title character, and his name is Oscar Wilde, and it's spelled like the writer Oscar Wilde, and he mentions this every now and again, almost as a running gag in this strip. But he's from Chicago, up in your neck of the woods, John.
Absolutely.
He comes down to Oklahoma, which is actually not too far from my neck of the woods right now. And, he finds a house on Craigslist. And now, something's up when he goes to the landlord or the landlady's house to get the keys to the place. We know that her name is Barbara because he calls her Barbara one or two times. But then as he's driving off and the camera, so to speak, or the visual perspective pulls back, you get to see Barbara's yard. And on the mailbox is the name Yaga. And you may not think that this is significant, except for the fact that about a panel or two before that visual pullback, and you see the name Yaga on the mailbox, both of her dogs, Barbara's dogs, that had been sniffing around and licking the hand of Oscar when he was there, have now turned into boys as they walk up to her porch. And you're going, huh? And then, of course, then the visual perspective pulls out, and so you see Yaga. She's Barbara Yaga. Okay, something freaky's going on here, and to expect something supernatural. And lo and behold, almost immediately after he gets to his house, he meets a ghost by the name of Sylvia Snyder. And she tells him that she died in 1948, and so she's kind of stuck in that time. And the cultural references that she makes are from around that period, or maybe a little after that. I mean, she doesn't get around much, needless to say. And so for her, something like the Polaroid camera is a revolutionary invention. And Oscar at one point explains to her that hardly anyone uses those anymore. And one of his first acts of kindness, because he's a very kind guy, right? He's always wanting to help others, is when he's out getting supplies and groceries, he comes back and he brings her an old Polaroid camera with quite a supply of film.
Yeah, and I think it plays off some interesting, kind of tropes of the ghost stories in general, right? That they're limited and they're stuck to one location. So what happens if you're stuck in that one location without really any outside contact? Because I believe there was some mention earlier on that Barbara Yaga was having trouble renting this house out, right? Because it's haunted. So the people who come to stay don't stay very long. So Sylvia doesn't really get that much exposure, even tangentially, right? There's no one around to turn on the television or to turn on the radio or what have you. So, or even bring in a newspaper, right? So she's seeing the world pass by from within the confines of those four walls, essentially. And it's not unless somebody else comes in and exposes her to these other things like Polaroids and television and cameras and whatever. She just doesn't have that exposure to even realize that. So I think that's one of the interesting things going on here is that as a character, Sylvia is almost more just about discovering what she's missed over the past half century.
Exactly.
Now,
Yeah, now Sylvia as a character, I mean, right now we're into Chapter 4 of Wild Life, and Sylvia was a big part of Chapter 1 when we're first introduced to Oscar and basically the context of the story itself. She appears a little bit in Chapter 2, but that's more about another character who figures prominently, and that's a teenager, a 16-year-old named Clifford, and he's the werewolf character. And then we see her a little bit in Chapter 3. We're not that far into Chapter 4, but I can already see where Lepas is, I think, going here, because I've wondered that almost from the very beginning. When I saw Sylvia and I saw that, she died young, so she's a very attractive character. She is maybe about the same age, perhaps a tad older than Oscar, or at least when she died, she was a little older maybe than Oscar is now. And there's a very easy friendship between the two of them, and they seem to really get along well. So, even in Chapter 1, I'm thinking, okay, how long will it be before we're going to have a romantic complication, right? Mm-hmm. And the last installment of Wild Life, and I'm trying to remember... That was just the other day, I think it was.
Yeah, it was very recent.
October 13th. Yeah, we're recording this on the 15th. Oscar, I think Chapter 4 has just started, and Oscar has been out on a date, and he comes back, and we see that Sylvia is sad.
Well, and there's even an allusion to that before. If you look at a couple of updates before the current one, where she just provides the chapter title or cover or whatever, it's a picture of Sylvia, kind of, I don't know if she's floating or lying on the floor or what have you, holding a Polaroid, and there's all these photos around, and several of them are Oscar, which makes sense to a degree that, she can't leave the house, and he's one of the few moving things going on. But if you look at them, there's some of the photos are clearly when Oscar was unaware that she was there taking a picture of him. I'm thinking in particular, there's one off of her right elbow of him sleeping on the couch.
That's a good. That's a great observation.
So I think there's, to your point, she's very much interested. We haven't really explored too much of their budding relationship. They're clearly friendly with each other, but I think, I think there's very clear evidence that that's where she's going with the strip, is to play off, at least for this next chapter.
Right, and we don't even know yet how she died, and in fact, at one point, Clifford asks her, and I think this was toward the end of Chapter 3, asks Oscar, well, have you talked with Sylvia about how she died? And he says, no, that just seems a little impolite. I don't feel like I can ask her that yet. I mean, and he's right. That's a very intimate thing, especially to ask a ghost, right? Mm-hmm. And so maybe in Chapter 4, since there seems to be some kind of romantic tension beginning to build here, this will be where we learn much more of a backstory of Sylvia. At least I hope. And maybe this says something about my sense of humor or depravity or what. But, I'm curious to see, okay, if something happens between these two, how's it going to happen? Because we know that she has problems with the physical world. She's pointed out before that sometimes it's difficult for her to turn things on like a TV, or at times to hold a camera, although she has no problem holding cards, I guess. So sometimes I've noticed that Lepas may not be consistent, really, in terms of the characterization. But, okay, I'll let that go. But let's say if there is some kind of budding affection between Oscar and Sylvia, how will that play out?
Well, I think there's some interesting... There's going to be a very interesting dynamic here because, even if the characters are roughly the same age, we've got Oscar, who has been living in the now, right, for his entire life.
Right.
And he's been going out, presumably on dates and having other relationships and whatnot. Sylvia, on the other hand, has been trapped in this house for 50 years. So she has not had a relationship or of any long-term we don't know what a relationship she may have had before she died, but she certainly hasn't had any since she died, right? Because, like I said, she's not even that aware of the outside world, or has that much access to the outside world. So this could be like the first even opportunity for a relationship that she's had in 50 years. So I think there'll be an interesting way to. I think there's an interesting opportunity there. I don't know if Lepas will play up this or not, but there's certainly an opportunity for exploring that notion of the staticness of her. I want to say life, but it's more of an unlife, I guess.
That's right.
Is how much of it is she actually. Is she really living in any sort of sense at this point? Or has her death essentially rendered her static for the rest of eternity?
Right. Now, I want to go back to an observation you made early on, and that is the links thematically and between Broodhollow and Wildlife. Another way in which both of these webcomics are similar is that location becomes very significant in just the mystery behind what's going on in the webcomic. And with Wildlife, we find out even in the first one or two chapters that there's something to the town. And by the way, the town is called Podunk. Podunk, Oklahoma. There's something about Podunk that is unusual and off, and even those supernatural characters that reside there aren't aware of how unusual this is. Oscar, at one point, and I think this is in chapter 2, when we first learn about Clifford, the 16-year-old werewolf, Oscar encounters other werewolves, as well as talking bears and these spiders that become very active. In other words, he experiences all of these strange, perhaps supernatural life forms, and when he mentions this to Clifford, Clifford basically says, I don't know, what you talking about, Oscar? Those things don't happen here. So there's something strange about Podunk. And, well, this is also where Barbara Yaga lives, right? So, there is mystery woven within the very fabric of this location, just as there is, regarding memory loss in Broodhollow.
Yeah, I'll be curious to see, as the story continues to play out, how much Yaga herself plays a role in that. Right, because historically, that was a very significant witch character, right? And it wasn't just, the Baba Yaga character from folklore was not just, okay, there's this weird witch out in the woods that will eat you, but she was controlling her environment, right? You didn't get anywhere near her house, because the house itself moved and she controlled the trees around it and all that. So I wonder how much, if this is the intention, how much Yaga will play into future stories as, a central point for which all of these supernatural occurrences kind of focus around.
Yeah, that's a good point, because we only see Barbara Yaga in one small part of the first chapter, and we really don't see her after that. Every now and again, a character will refer to Barbara, but we only see her that one time. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking forward to a house with chicken legs.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I was very disappointed not to see her house get up and walk away, frankly.
Mm-hmm. So, and this is a relatively young webcomic, and, we've basically encapsulated about all of what's gone on so far. But it's one that I would like to come back to and find out how this story unfolds.
Yeah, and the reason I found out about it in the first place is I was following Lepas's previous webcomic. It was called Zap, which was, I quite enjoyed that. It was more of a science fiction bent. It was definitely, I'd say, more of a science fiction bent. It was straight up science fiction. But one of the things I liked about what she was doing with that is she was very evidently improving her skills as she was going on. And if you read through the entire comic, you can watch almost in real time, watch her improve her ability as as a craftsman, as a webcomic artist. As an illustrator, as a storyteller, whatever you want to, all of those things. So when she gets to Wildlife here, I think she's got several years of mastery under her belt, but I think she's going to continue to improve as well. I think she's definitely one of those artists where she is constantly striving to do better, and it's not something that's necessarily something she talks about or refers to from what I've seen in her Twitter stream or anything, but it's evident in the work itself. I think she's always looking to up her game on a personal level, even for whatever personal satisfaction she might have out of that. And I think it's an early enough story, and there's a lot of places she can go with it, both as a creator as well as a storyteller. And I think there's a lot of potential there.
Right, and you also talked about her developing her art, not just her storytelling. And it's worth mentioning that the art in Wildlife is much more realistically looking, much more detailed than we saw with Broodhollow. And in fact, we didn't arrange the stories to discuss this month in this way, but going from Straub's Broodhollow to Lepas's Wildlife, and then the next one we're going to discuss, Mike Walton's False Positive, you're basically going from kind of a more simple, almost cartoony style to progressing to a more detailed, almost realistic art style, because as we'll see in a few minutes with False Positive, the art is much more detailed and realistic in the way that characters and settings are represented. But coming back to Wildlife, it's really good art, and the layout of this website, I find it's easier to navigate. Now, granted, Lepas doesn't have near as much webcomic under her belt with this one as Straub does with Broodhollow, but if you click on the chapters tab on the website, not only can you go from one chapter to the next, but you have a drop-down archive. And, well, it's almost calendar-like as well, because the pages, well, they're numbered, but you also have dates there. It's a little easier to navigate, I think, than with Broodhollow. So it's easier to get places. Also, like Broodhollow, Lepas allows readers to comment underneath all of the installments, and she apparently has a very dedicated and wide following as well.
Well, yeah, like I said, she's been doing this the webcomic thing for quite a while herself, and I think she's built up enough of an audience that there are people who are going to follow her around regardless of what she's doing. Right? She's like, she's in some ways following Kris in the same kind of pattern. Right? She did spent several years working on a science fiction story, and then switched gears over to go to this more supernatural horror type of genre. And I think a lot of people followed him. Same thing we saw with Straub, I think, is there's a lot of people were reading Zap, liked what they saw, and continued over here. And, with good reason. Like I said, she's clearly showing a lot of talent and a lot of dedication to her craft, which I think speaks very highly of her. The other thing the one differentiation factor I might add too is, in terms of the navigation, she does have those chapters break out like Straub does, but I think where it works better in her favor is that the chapters are just a hell of a lot shorter. Even if you just go to the beginning of chapter 2 and have to click through it, it's not going to take you nearly as long as trying to click through all of chapter 2 from Broodhollow.
Right. This may be a little off, but you mentioned her previous webcomic, Zap, and I have not read that one. There is a link to it on the About page, and so it does look interesting. I may want to check that out. But I'm just wondering, okay, so you're a comics creator, right? Now, you're working on the web, but, you have some experience, knowledge, history, I would hope, of comics, maybe comics in America, comics worldwide. Why would you choose to call your comic Zap? And now, granted, this has an exclamation mark, but wouldn't, I don't know, Robert Crumb immediately come to mind?
I don't know what the thinking was behind that, quite frankly. I know that she did work on that comic with another individual, so it wasn't necessarily her idea alone to put that out there. She was actually just the artist on that, and there was another gentleman whose name I forget offhand was doing the writing. I don't know how exactly they split the creative duties. It may have been full script or Marvel method or however. I don't know, but she was not the only influencing factor on the naming of that strip, I suspect.
Right. Okay, it's like, okay, I want to make a film. I'm going to call it Citizen Kane. Well, I don't think she's doing like a Kathy Acker here, right?
Right.
She's not, writing a novel called Don Quixote, and it's not Don Quixote.
Right.
But she's doing it knowingly, right?
Well, I think actually there's probably a bigger concern from the webcomics perspective, regardless of the Crumb reference. Even if assuming you didn't know that at all. This is part of, I think, figuring out how webcomics work, just at a fundamental level. If you tell somebody you were working on a webcomic called Zap, and they say, oh, okay, that's great, I'll Google it. What do you get when you Google Zap? I haven't tried, but I can almost guarantee you her comic does not come up first.
Actually, it does.
Really?
It depends. I did, and I'm back at Google now, I did a search, Zap Comic, C-O-M-I-C, not I-X. And the very first entry on Google is Zap Online Comic, and it's hers. Now,
but what about if you just do Zap, though? That's...
Well, then that'll give you a lot of things even beside comics. So
exactly.
If you just do Zap, that gives... Oh, God, there's some Israeli website that I'd have to translate to... And then... Actually, Zap, her comic, is the third entry, and I just did a search on Zap without the exclamation mark. And then under that is Zap World, then a variety of other... Zap Comics is toward the bottom of that first page, and that's the Wikipedia entry. So...
And I think, well, where I was going with that, though, is that it makes it... It's not impossible to find, but it's more challenging than it needs to be. Right. I think one of the most classic examples on the flip side of that is XKCD. The reason why he named it XKCD is because, A, that's the only thing that's called XKCD, right? There's absolutely nothing else in the world where you would use those initials except for his comic.
Right.
And in the second place, he can get that domain name, XKCD, because no one else is using it. So if you have something called Zap, right, you can't get zap.com. You have to get webcomic.com or zapcomic.com or something like that. I suspect she had a similar issue with Wildlife. Even with the, I don't think we actually referenced the URL. It's
Well, that's right. We should. It's
wildlifecomic.com, and that's WILDELIFE comic.com. But I suspect she had a similar issue with that, in that if you just went with wildlife, that could be used in any number of ways by any number of people. So she would have had to have gotten Wildlife Comic as a domain name, which, from it works and it makes sense, but it's maybe not the most ideal from a search perspective. It makes it a little bit more difficult than it necessarily needs to be to find you. If you're looking for XKCD, just my mentioning that, exactly where to go. Wildlife Comic, everybody was listening to this for the past 20 minutes that we've been talking and saying, where the hell is this comic? I want to look at it. So.
Yeah, we should have mentioned that at the outset. Yes, it's wildlifecomic.com. And in fact, I just did a search on wildlife.com, and I have... I don't know what the hell this website is, because it seems like it's doing several things. Wildlife, We Are Forest People. It says, welcome to the Wildlife website. There's wildlife consulting. There's something about self-defense and empowerment, humor. This is like a content headache. But yes, if you want to go to the much better designed wildlife webcomic site, it is wildlifecomic.com. Now, we should say at the top of our discussion of the third webcomic where we're looking at, in this we're putting under the completed category. We're going to be discussing False Positive by various stories by Mike Walton, and the web address for this is falsepositivecomic.com, so he's using a similar strategy.
Well, I think he's, just to kind of continue that conversation, he's probably running into a similar issue too, right? If you look for just false positive, that could mean any number of things. And I think it's, and it's, I don't know if it's necessarily a fair criticism because, right, there's only so many words you can string together and make sense in the English language. There's bound to be some weird overlaps on things and some unexpected things. But that's I point that out as a challenge that the more commonly used words that are in your comic title, the more difficult it's going to be for people to find you. If you're a Kris Straub, maybe you can get away with it because you've got enough of an audience to carry over from your previous comic. But if you haven't been in the business for a decade or longer, something like an XKCD approach might make more sense.
Right. Now, this webcomic is very similar to something that Andy Wolverton and I discussed back in June on the webcomic show. It's like Sam Costello's Split Lip. And in fact, Split Lip would have been a very good webcomic to discuss for the month of October if we're talking about horror and the macabre. It's just that we'd already discussed Split Lip in the past. So it's not just one story, but it is a collection of short stories or short webcomic stories. And that's the way that False Positive is set up. Now, it looks like that Walton's first strip began back in 2011, I think it was. I'm looking at the date, and it is a story. Oh, what is this one? Is this? Because he has a list of these. If you go to the website, you can see the various stories that make up the False Positive site. Concoction, I think, is the first one, and this came out in September of 2011. So, this one's been around for a while, and if you go to the homepage, you can see that there are a variety of stories here. The most recent completed one is called Incantation. Others, Cops and Robbers, Yolk, Newton's Apple, Stink Eye, Specimen, Found in His Hand, Sentinel, so on and so forth. So there are quite a number of stories here, and you and I aren't going to discuss all of them because we just don't have enough time. But what we decided to do is similar to what Andy and I did when we looked at Split Lips. There are 2 or 3 that each of us read, and so we can talk about them here or there. And I think if you do read 2 or 3 or 4 of the stories on False Positive, you have a pretty good sense of what this webcomic is all about.
Yeah, and it's since it's all Walton's material, or nearly all. I think he's got Daniel Govar did one strip, as I recall. But since most of it is Walton himself doing the writing, doing the art, they all have, by obvious extension, a kind of similar feel to them, right? It's always the same, or very similar art, always a similar sensibility to how he's approaching the story.
Right. So which story did you read that you want to begin discussing?
The one I read that I actually kind of liked was this Found in His Hand, which is... It's more of a supernatural story than like a straight-up horror story, I suppose you'd say.
A supernatural heist story.
Yeah, see, it's the interesting thing is the supernatural part doesn't come until towards the very end. It's basically, as we start off, we see a group of 5 or 6 individuals fully clothed in black as breaking into somebody's house. And they're talking about, and it's a fairly typical heist type of story at that point. They're looking for, I think it's mentioned somewhere a little bit later that an original Gutenberg Bible that they're going to steal from this rich person's house and they've already got a fence lined up, and they'll be able to split the money however many, 6 ways. They'll all be super rich because it's a Gutenberg Bible, right? Those are on the rare side, you might say. But as we get into the story, we finally realize, they get to the secret location, the hidden vault. They break in past all the security measures and all that, and eventually get to the secret location. And it turns out that the guy leading the entire group is not actually after the Bible at all. That was just a ruse to get the other people to help him out. He was really after, and I hesitate to say what he was after, but he was after something else that was kind of unexpected.
Very unexpected.
Yeah. He does manage to do that, but in the process, while they're kind of sneaking through the house, the owner comes home and starts taking care of business, essentially. And that leads up to the final confrontation of this lead heist man confronting the house owner. And
you're trying your best not to give things away.
Yeah, it's
here.
really hard, I got to say. It's not a long story, right? It's only, like 20 pages or something, right? But yeah, so then it culminates with this. The climax is basically this heist person confronting the homeowner, and the two of them duking it out to the death, essentially.
Right.
But the interesting thing in dealing with that is that, as they're kind of relaying, it seems like as we start getting past this, it's not just a typical heist story, we start getting these supernatural elements kind of getting dropped in, right? The one safe that he opens isn't using a typical, a lock or key mechanism. It's actually got some kind of spiritual component to it, right? Where he has to.
It's unlike with the tuning fork. This is the second time tonight that we've discussed tuning forks in webcomics.
It's all about the theme. It is all about the theme today. But yeah, so then we finally get to this final confrontation, and there are what appear to be spells thrown around and incantations and all kinds of. It gets kind of wildly out of control. And I think that's kind of the interesting thing is that, as you're progressing throughout the story, there's all these little twists and turns that spin the story a little bit differently than you thought.
Right.
And it's not really, and I don't think it's too much to say it kind of gets into this supernatural realm. I don't think that's spoiling anything per se. But
well, no, I mean the tagline of False Positive, and he has it up at the top banner: webcomic tales of the surreal, fantastic, and macabre. So you know what you're getting.
Yeah, but I think the way he executes that, and the way he kind of slowly parses out the wait, okay, no, not really. Oh, wait, no, not really. Oh, wait, no, not really. I think he does a very good job of that, and it makes for an interesting read in that it's always they're not big revelations in like kind of a M. Night Shyamalan type of respect, right? They're all these like little just slight turns, not
right.
He doesn't kind of flip the switch and go 180 on you. He just oh, wait, this is not quite what you thought it was. Oh, wait, this part isn't quite what you thought it was. And there's just enough of those tweaks as you go through the story to make it continually interesting, particularly towards the latter half of it, I think.
Right. Well, something similar goes on with another story that I think you read as well, and that was Seance.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this one begins with, I guess in a similar manner as the other one. You say it started off as a, kind of a typical heist narrative. Well, this one starts off as a typical seance narrative, where you have the woman who is the medium leading everything, has a group of characters, and this looks like it's taking place around the 1920s or 30s. So again, we're back in a similar time period as we were in Broodhollow. So another theme going on here. And so she has this collection of characters around a table, and she's making connection with the dead or people who are beyond the veil, as they put it. And it's what you would expect. She takes on the voice of those who were dead, but then things take a strange, unexpected, and very violent turn.
Actually, a couple of violent turns, I might say there. It's really kind of interesting. As I've read enough about seances through other interests that the setup was very familiar to me, right? As, the initial couple pages, she's sitting down, the medium's saying, okay, now here you have to sit down, your hands on the table, and thumbs and pinky fingers touching, and that whole bit. She's got the candles going. She's got the kind of the incantations that don't ring false because they're thrown in a weird language or something, and it's exactly the type of thing that you would expect a medium to do, because we've all seen it a million times. It's all been troped at some level repeatedly, but for a reason, right? That's how mediums actually performed their services. Certainly, at least back in the day. I don't know if they still do or not, but these are the exact type of things that Harry Houdini was going around trying to debunk for the latter part of his career. Right. But then, as we say, things go south.
Yeah. Earlier I was talking about Walton's art, and I have to say that with Seance, of what I've read, and I haven't read all the stories, I've read several of the ones on False Positive, but this is one of those that I really enjoy the art. And, I mentioned earlier that if we look at the three creators that we're discussing on this month's Webcomics episode, Walton is the one that is the most detailed and realistic in his rendering of character, even though this is a very surreal, fantastic series of stories. But I love the way that the art plays out in the story Seance. And we should mention that every single one of the stories seems to have a different color scheme or color palette that he's working with. And for the most part, things seem to be duotoned, or I guess duochromatic, where you may have one, perhaps two base colors. And depending on what story you're in, it may be kind of a lighter blue or green or gray or brownish sepia type color. And I like the variation of the palette that he's working with here. But I guess overall I really love the art in Seance. Another story whose art I think is really fantastic, and I don't know if you've read this one, but that is, I guess, the most recently completed one, Incantation. Did you read that?
No, I kind of scanned through it, but I did not read it.
This is an easy one to scan through in that it's not entirely wordless, but this is one of those stories that is primarily a visual narrative more than it is made up of text. And what you have is it starts off with a character who's in some kind of, almost looks like a shrine, a church-like setting, and he's sacrificing himself. And so he plunges a knife into his stomach, and as he's, I'm assuming, dying, it's kind of freaky. A little mouse comes out of his mouth, and so then the mouse runs away. Then the mouse turns into, as it's running, a rabbit. Then the rabbit turns into, I think it's a gazelle. It's not a deer. And this is where the wordless story comes into play. You get to see this creature, whatever the hell it is, transforming from, out of this guy's mouth. He's just committed suicide. And as it moves along, it becomes one creature, then another at one point. As it's leaping off of a cliff, it turns into a shark. The shark turns into this wonderful-looking squid. The squid turns into a bird in the air. The bird turns into, after that, a dragonfly. And then the dragonfly attaches itself onto a pregnant woman. And I won't give away what happens at the end. But it's a story that's basically a series of visual transformations that I think are really nicely rendered.
Yeah, they really are. He does a good job. Like I just said, I scanned through it, but that was definitely one of the standout pieces is seeing, even though he essentially gave each animal a single panel, there was still enough continuity from one to the next that you could tell that I had no problem, even, like I said, just scanning through, that it was one animal changing into another and not, okay, here's a picture of a rabbit, here's a picture of an elk, here's a picture of a shark, or what have you. It was very clear that was a progression, and I thought he did a very good job of showcasing that, especially wordlessly. And like I said, it's the notion of seeing that a character progress or transform from one creature to another, that's been going around for decades, right? That was the old Captain Marvels, where Billy Batson would turn into Shazam, or Captain Marvel with the word Shazam. The Fantastic Four, where we saw the Ben Grimm shift into the Thing. That kind of stuff we've seen those types of transformations before, and they typically either happen in a way where you have to explain what's going on with a caption, a la Shazam, or you see an entire page where you see the entire all the steps of the transformation, like a Jack Kirby kind of thing. But here, like I said, he essentially only dedicates one panel per animal, but you still get that sense of transition. You still get that sequencing of one to the next without any difficulty whatsoever, even just, like I said, even just with a quick scan through. I think that was very well done.
Yeah. And, some of the other stories that I've read, Stink Eye is interesting. It wasn't one of my favorites. That one is, in many ways, kind of a fantasy story that does become horrific toward the last half. But one I liked even more than some of the others is Frenzy. And this begins as a classic noir narrative. And in fact, if you go to the very first page, it looks like a movie screen. So, you're looking at the opening credits of a film called Frenzy. And the way that it's described is as False Positive Pictures presents Frenzy, a big Mike Walton production. And, again, it just looks like a classic let's say 1940s, 1950s film that you're about to see. And that's the way that this story unfolds. I mean, really classic, a 1930s or 1940s detective, private eye. When we see him in his office, his secretary, or his girl, I guess as they're called in the genre, she got him a stake so he can put on his eye. So, you say, okay, well, he got beat up. And so he's putting the stake on his eye as he's taking a stiff drink. And then he begins to recall the various events that, in good noir fashion, that led to where he is right now. And as the story unfolds, it becomes creepy and macabre, and so that's when the horror comes into play. But one of the things I particularly... And it gets really wild to the point that it's almost as if Walton was throwing in almost every horror element but the kitchen sink. But one of the things I really appreciated about this story is not only the visuals that looks like classic noir, but the references to the detective narratives. So the detective, his name itself is Hammett. And a character who hires him to do work goes by the name of Chandler. So I appreciated that.
There were actually, I've seen a number of little asides like that. There was a piece in the Found in His Hand bit too, where they once they break into that secret vault. I'm trying to look for the page now, where they finally break in and you see this room full of artifacts, clearly trying to show that the homeowner had a lot of stuff that was rare and valuable, and there was a reason why it was all getting hidden away. And if you just look through, there are all these little Easter eggs of stuff that he's drawn in, pays no attention to in terms of the story, but clearly just showing, hey, there's a lot of these little shout outs to other things. There was I'm still looking for the page here.
Well, that speaks to what I was mentioning earlier, his detailed style.
Yeah, there was, I'm trying, here we go. There's the mask from Loki, from the Mask movie. There's the the idol from Raiders of the Lost Ark. There's one of the statues from that grabbed some of the people from Beetlejuice. There's, what else am I seeing here? There's the owl, the mechanical owl from Clash of the Titans. A lot of these weird little artifacts just thrown in, probably mostly for his own amusement more than anything else. And I'm sure there's a couple other eyes I kind of vaguely recognize, but couldn't place off the top of my head. And I'm sure some that I'm not recognizing at all. But he's clearly, putting in a lot of material, not just to the level of detail, but also, doing that kind of throwback thing, like with the naming that you just mentioned on the noir piece. He's kind of giving these highlight to other rare and unique artifacts that might be considered valuable, and it's not just him working in his own world. He's kind of acknowledging these other influences that he has.
Well, Sean, we've looked at 3 really interesting, detailed comics, all of which have something to do, I think, with the spirit of the month of October and Halloween. We started off with Kris Straub's Broodhollow. After that, we moved on to Pascalle Lepas's Wilde Life, and then we wrapped up with our quote-unquote completed webcomic, False Positive, a series of stories by Mike Walton. So a lot of good comics, a lot of great reading, and we recommend that you guys check them out, whether, in the month of October or otherwise. And if you want to check out other great comics, then you would do well to visit the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. Their website is dcbservice.com. They also have a sister company that Sean pointed out at the top of the show, and that is mydigitalcomics.com. So whether you like to get your comics in digital form or in hard copy, those are the places to go. Check them out. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things that you're reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find on the right-hand side of your browser a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. But if you want to go old school, then pick up the phone and call us that way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you want to use email for perhaps making it easier to copy and paste a web address of your favorite webcomic, you can email us at 2guys, that's TWOGUIS, at comicsalternative.com. Or you can contact me directly at Sean@comicsalternative.com. And I think you, Derek, have a web address as well, an email address to use?
It is Derek@comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter. We're at 2 guys with PhDs, and we're on other social networking sites as well, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, and Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel, so if you like to consume your media that way, then check us out on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, you can stream us on Stitcher, you can also find us on TuneIn, and as always, you can find every single one of our episodes as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on the blog, and that's at our website, comicsalternative.com. So, Sean, a lot of ways for people to get in touch with us.
I got lost in all of them, quite frankly. We'll have to we'll have to narrow it down or something. I say we send everybody to comicsalternative.com and just look at the Contact Us page.
Yeah, go to comicsalternative.com. Use whatever means you want to contact us. But we do like hearing from you. So, and as Sean did suggest, we like suggestions of webcomics. So get in touch with us with those. And until next month's show, I'm Derek.
And I'm Sean. And we're 2 guys talking about webcomics at comicsalternative.com.